know you're all very tired at this time of day, but I just want to make you aware of this really important thing, which is the World Trade Organization Trade Facilitation Agreement. Who's heard of the agreement? Anyone heard of it? You're not alone. Most of the world has never heard of this agreement, and I always call it the most important trade agreement that no one has ever heard of. Because it's true. It's not well publicised, there's not a great deal of knowledge about it, but it's a hugely important trade facilitation agreement, and I'll explain why. So we'll just quickly look at why it's important, we'll look at the background, we'll look at the structure, and about technical assistance and where it may be needed. So, it's the first agreement ever concluded by the World Trade Organization that has been agreed by every member. Okay? Normally they try and get a consensus, a majority, but this agreement has been agreed by every member of the World Trade Organization. And of course that includes Ukraine. Just in case you're wondering, you know, Ukraine is a member of the WTO, and interestingly, Ukraine was one of the first countries to ratify the agreement. One of the first countries. And what does that tell me? It tells me that Ukraine is very serious about trade facilitation, about making international trade easier. So it's an important agreement, and it's important for you. What's the agreement about? Well, this is what the agreement is designed to do. Firstly, to expedite the movement, release and clearance of goods, including goods in transit. In other words, when your goods enter Ukraine, or leave Ukraine and enter another country, it's meant to speed up that process, the export process, the transit process, and the import process. So it's meant to speed up the way trade moves. It's meant to promote effective cooperation between customs and other authorities, and it's meant to recognise and facilitate compliant traders. So if you're a trader, an exporter, with a good record of compliance with customs, you will get facilitated treatment for your exports. It means they'll move quicker through your supply chains, and that's important. If you look at the numbers here, I don't know if you can see those, but they're interesting numbers. If you look at exports of WTO member states, they totaled 16.2 trillion in 2015. $16.2 trillion. That's a lot of dollars. We could all live off that for a long time. It's a lot of money. And it shows the power of trade between World Trade Organization members. And do remember that virtually every country in the world is a member of the World Trade Organization. So the amount of trade between members is absolutely huge. And with the numbers up here, this is interesting, because what does it mean for Ukraine? Well, what it does, when the agreement is fully implemented for every country, it brings down the cost of doing business. It brings down the cost of exports, and it brings down the cost of imports. And there are some numbers up there to give you an indication of what I'm talking about. So, if we speak about where it impacts, this is not very well. It's a bit better. So, phew, it's still that. Tripped over all the wires. So, if we look at, for example, one of the sections is about simplifying trade documents. About, we spoke about 40 documents this morning. The first section is about reducing and simplifying documents. And that alone, if we look at developing countries, that will reduce the business cost by 3%. Middle-income countries, it will reduce the cost of business by 2.7%. So that means, for you in Ukraine, the cost of organising your exports goes down by 2.7%. So what that means is you make 2.7% extra profit. And that should make you very happy. And that's just that section alone. If we look at the next one is about streamlining border processes, streamlining customs processes. For an upper middle income country, that will reduce costs by 2.8%. And we go on. If we look at things like ensuring the availability of information, advanced rulings, we can see there are huge, huge savings. And what we have to do is we have to add across to get an indication of what the total savings will be. So, for example, if we look at Ukraine, as a middle-income country, we add all the numbers and we get 4.3%, 5.9%, 7.1%. So we estimate that the cost of doing your exports and your imports will reduce by about 7% when the agreement is fully implemented. That's bringing down the cost of doing business, it's making you more competitive and more profitable. Can you now see why this is such an important trade agreement? You know, in all of your companies, just think about what a saving of 7% in cost would do. You should all be smiling and happy. This is big. These aren't made up numbers, these are real numbers. Give yourself a 7% salary increase. You can afford to do it, but it's been implemented. Make your product 7% more competitive. That's got to be a good thing. So this is hugely important. So the background is, it took a long time for the agreement to come into force. The background to the agreement is basically that, as I mentioned earlier on today, the World Trade Organization, their main goal has been to reduce tariff rates, to reduce import duties globally, and they've gone as far as they can go. Over 50 years they've done a lot of work on it, and duty rates have gone down. There's no question about it, they have gone down. And it got to the stage, probably about 5 years ago, where they thought, well actually, we're putting a lot of effort into duty rates and reducing them, but probably we've gone as far as we can. And they said, what other constraints are there to international trade? And they did a lot of research on it, so it wasn't hard to do. And they found out that, you know, tariff barriers, import duties are a constraint to trade, but there are lots of other ones. Too much documentation, too much bureaucracy, bad border procedures, corruption, expensive transport costs, using paper instead of electronic documents. All these things add to the cost of doing business. And they said, okay, what we now need is to concentrate our efforts on reducing these barriers. And that's what this agreement does. Under the World Trade Organization rules, as soon as 2/3 of the membership agree to something, it comes into force. So once 2/3 of the member countries of the WTO say, yeah, we're going to do it, it comes into force straight away. Now, back in 2016, you know, when it got towards August, September 2016, people said to me, said to a lot of people, when will the agreement come into force? And my answer at that stage was, well, probably around 2020. You know, countries are ratifying the agreement, but very, very slowly. So it probably won't be till about 2020. And that's what everyone thought. That's what the World Trade Organization thought. And then between September and December 2016, loads of countries ratified. Boom, 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 boom. The ratifications came in very quickly. And because of that, by February last year, 2/3 of the membership had ratified. So the agreement came into force 3 years before anyone thought it would. And probably it's the only trade agreement anywhere, ever, that's come into force early. Normally they come into force late. This was about 3 years early. Which is incredible. Because everyone could see the value. Every country in the world that's a WTO member, which is most countries, could see the value and ratified very, very, very quickly. So it came into force last year in February. And that means countries really have to get moving and they have to implement the agreement. So when we look at it, what's it all about? If we just sum up the objectives, expedite the movement, release and clearance of goods. In other words, speed up the movement of goods. Improve cooperation between customs and other authorities. enhance technical assistance, and set up a committee in each country to make sure the agreement is implemented. So here in Ukraine, there will be a trade facilitation committee. And that committee will be partly public sector and partly private sector. And that committee will put pressure on the government here to implement the agreement on a priority basis. There are about 70 measures. They can't all be implemented at once anyway, but they have to be priorities. Every country has got to do the same. So every country has to have a trade facilitation committee that will oversee the implementation of the agreement. Okay. So, the structure of the agreement is in 3 parts. Section 1 is the technical areas that have to be implemented. We'll have a look at those briefly to see what kind of things they are. So Section 1 is the technical areas which every country has to implement. Section 2 is a special section for developing countries. Because the WTO are very, very clear that the agreement isn't just for developed countries. The agreement is for every country which is a WTO member. Everyone has to do it. But they recognise that less developed countries will need more time, and they may need help in implementing the agreement. So Section 2 is all about how developing countries will implement the agreement. They will be allowed a bit more time. And Section 3 is about the requirement for every country to have a trade facilitation committee. That's what Section 3 is. So those are the 3 sections. When we look at the structure of the agreement, it's interesting just to quickly look at how it's structured. And the way it's structured is that every country, which is a member of the WTO, has had to make commitments to the World Trade Organization. And under those commitments, they have to say for all of the measures, and as I mentioned, there are about 70 measures within about 12 sections or 12 articles. And altogether about 70 measures. And what every country has had to do is for each one of those 70 measures, they've had to say their category A, category B, or category C. Category A means that we are currently doing it. So that measure is something that we are already doing in Ukraine. Category B is something that the country has to say, okay, we're not doing that yet, but we can implement that within a year or 2 years. They have to be taxed. And category C, they're saying is, okay, that measure we need time to do it, and we need technical assistance to do it. So 3 categories, A, B, and C. And every country has had to do this. They categorise each of the approximately 70 measures as category A, category B, or category C. And if you go to the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement website, you can look up Ukraine, you can look up any country, and it will tell you what's been implemented and what hasn't yet been implemented. You can do that for any country which is a WTO. So, if we look at the articles, and I'm not going to go through them in detail, I just want to give you an idea of what the articles are. So, Article 1 is all about the publication and availability of information. And that says that every country must have a central database with all export, import, transit, documentation, requirement, processes, procedures, duty rates, everything available in one place. A central inventory that you can just click on and say, okay, I want to export my hovercraft to Taiwan, China, what do I have to do? You go into that, you click on that, through the commodity code, it will tell you the documents you need, what market access arrangements there are, what the duty rates are, it will tell you everything you need to know. Any documents you need for a Ukraine export will be there in the same place. Okay? So, a really easy way of getting information and sourcing information. It will be, and it's got to be accurate, it's got to be good, and it's got to be regularly updated, because information changes. So the update is very important. Okay? And that's what Article 1 is about. That website has to be established. Not many countries have got that yet. In the UK, we haven't got that. It's a very, very important thing. And when I talk to exporters and importers, they tell me that that's the most important article for their business. To be able to get information from one place really quickly, really accurately. So that's what Article 1 is. Article 2 is about the opportunity to comment. That means that what customs here in Ukraine can't do is say, okay, from tomorrow there'll be a new regulation, or from next week there's a new regulation, you have to follow that regulation. They're not allowed, they won't be allowed to do that. They have to consult with you, the trade, first, and they have to give you the opportunity to comment. And you may say, for our agricultural industry, this won't work for us, for this reason. But they have to give the opportunity to comment, and they have to listen to you. Again, very, very important. Article 3 is all about advanced rulings. So you want to know that your goods meet the rules of origin for duty-free access to the European Union. Okay? You may not be sure. You know the commodity code, you can give them the components. You know, let's say this percentage of this oil, you give them all the information. Under the advanced ruling article, that means that customs have to give you an advanced ruling. And that advanced ruling has to be valid for at least 3 years. So they would say to you, yeah, we've done our checks, commodity codes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, with those proportions and that product, they do meet the rules of origin for sales to the European Union. And once they've made that ruling is in place for at least 3 years. That's what we mean by the advanced ruling. If you don't know how to classify your goods, you know, it can be confusing. Classifications can be very, very confusing. And you have to get the right commodity code. You can get a ruling on classification. And you give all the details, probably to customs, for this thing. And they say, okay, we will give a ruling, you need to classify that as HS number 8256387012. And once they've given that ruling, it has to be enforced for at least 3 years. So that's advanced rulings. Very, very important for business planning. Appeal procedures. If customs do something that you don't agree with, you have the right of appeal twice. So they do something, you don't agree with what they've done, you can appeal to the next senior officer up. If you're still not happy with the result, you can ask for independent appeal. You will have the right to do it. And customs have to support you going through that process. So you will always have the right to appeal. What else? Article 5, other measures to enhance impartiality, non-discrimination and transparency, SPS, customs and origins. So those of you who deal with food, agriculture, SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary certification for export is very important. It really matters. That article will make the whole SPS process a lot simpler, a lot more straightforward, easier to document. So when you have a lot of agricultural exports, that becomes very important. Article 6, disciplines on fees and charges imposed in relation to an import or an export. So there is no guesswork over how much things are going to cost. Every time you export something or import it, any fees which may be payable have to be published. And you will only be charged the fees that are published. Okay? So if you think someone's cheating you, you're paying too many fees or the wrong fees, you can check. Okay? And the official fees have to be published. And if you're not paying the official fees, then you have to ask, why am I paying more than the official fee? So publication fees, Article 6, again, a very important article. Article 7 is a long article, the release and clearance of goods. There's a lot to it. It's things like being able to do everything electronically. Okay, so if you're exporting and importing, no more filling in forms and sending them to different government organisations. You fill in one form electronically, you press the button to the single window, and that's what you do. So it's a single point of entry for export and import documentation. Again, hugely important. Countries that have that will really put down the cost of doing business. And it's interesting, the single window, we're seeing that in many developing countries and emerging countries, but not necessarily developed countries, which is a bit strange. So the first single window is in Singapore, but other countries that have single window are places like Senegal, the Philippines, China, Kenya, Ghana, South Africa. A real mix, but not many developed countries, which is strange. In the UK, we don't have a single window. We haven't got one. Kyrgyzstan is getting one at the moment. Kazakhstan has one. Cambodia's getting one. But we're not seeing that at the moment here. But here, there will be one. Because you're a WTO member, you will get a single window. That will bring down the cost of doing business. What else do we have here? Yeah, reduction in documents. Not so many documents. Cut down those 40 documents. Less physical examination of goods at export and import. Because those of you who are exporters are probably importing as well. Under this, global best practice is that not more than 3% of imports should be physically examined by customs. Not more than 3%. Not more than 10% should have documents examined, and 87% should move straight through without any customs checks. 87% of all imports should be free of checks. Okay? This will reinforce that. That's a World Customs Organization best practice. This reinforces it. So, much more clearance of goods. Rapid release times, reduced guarantees, deferred payments. So the whole process will be, and this matters really for imports, probably more than exports in this particular article. But if you're importing, what it means is that as soon as it arrives in Ukraine, you should be able to take it to your warehouse and do your customs formalities later and pay any duty later. It's for trusted traders, it becomes a really expedited process, a really quick process. And for exports, the same thing. In some countries, they actually inspect exports. It's a crazy thing to do. In some countries, they do that. With this agreement, they won't be able to do that anymore. Exports will go straight through the screen. Article 9, this is all about transit goods. Article 10 is all about dematerialisation of documents. So this is all about getting away from paper transactions and using electronic messages. That's what they mean by dematerialisation. So instead of having to present paper documents to customs or other authorities, everything has to have the ability to be done electronically. Again, that really brings down the cost of doing business. Customs cooperation and institutional arrangements. Well, customs cooperation means exactly as it sounds. Customs authorities in different countries must cooperate with each other. And that includes having things like one-stop border policies. So if you look at any Ukrainian border, any country that you border with, what country do you trade with the most on one of the borders? Poland, maybe? Poland, probably? Is that fair? Okay. So look at the Ukraine-Poland border. Now, typically, when you cross a border with a cargo will leave Ukraine and go through an export customs process. It will enter Poland and go through an import customs process. Is that right? That's generally what happens in most countries. You leave one country and go through an export process, come to the other country and go through an import process. Under this arrangement, the one-stop border process, we bring them together. We don't go through an export process, we do them both at the same time. It reduces time and therefore it reduces cost. And again, this is one of those strange areas where developing countries have taken the lead. So one-stop border posts, the first ones were actually in East Africa. And if you look at the border between Kenya and Tanzania, they're two countries next to each other. If you look at that border, if you had a truck of cargo, up till 2 years ago, that truck could be waiting at the border typically for 5 or 6 days for customs clearance. Now the process takes 2 minutes. What a result! Can you imagine? 6 days to 2 minutes. All that happens is, as the truck approaches the Kenyan side of the border, it slows down, number plate recognition, okay, a customs-free entry, so it will slow down, go under the bridge, go straight through, and having gone through that bridge, it will enter Tanzania with no more checks. It's really cool. Now, of course, they'll stop trucks at random to do a random check, but very irregular. That's hugely reduced the cost of doing business. And if you think about it, so whereas you could have, a journey which should take 2 days if you went straight through, and now it does take probably a day, 24 hours, but it could take 7 days before. So you had to hire a truck for 7 days, because that's how long it could take. Now it's much, much quicker. Think how that reduces costs. And that's quite an extreme example. That is an extreme example. But even here in this region, to cut down the cost of the time at borders, it reduces costs. So it's really important. And then the final article, so then we have articles 13 to 22, and those are the developing countries. Ukraine is not a developing country, you're a middle-income country, so we don't have to worry about it. And Article 23 is all about the institutional arrangements to have a trade facilitation committee in every country, which is the WTO. So that's the package of measures that we have. And if you put them together, they really make a big difference in relation to the speed of doing business. Now, if you want more detail, and you've got them in your folders, it goes through one by each of the articles. You'll find it in your folders one by one. It's all there. So if you want more detail, have a look at it. You don't really need to know a huge amount of detail, but if you do want more detail, then have a look at it. One of the interesting parts of the agreement is that clearly it's important that every country can implement the agreement. Now, one of the issues really is that it's quite easy for developed countries to implement the agreement. So for the European Union, for the USA, for China, for Ukraine to implement the agreement is not a hard thing to do. But some of the emerging markets that you may want to deal with, it can be difficult for you. So donors have said, okay, every country has got to implement the agreement, so we will provide some. And there are conditions for developing countries, less developed countries, and emerging markets to make it easy for them to implement the agreement. And some developed countries are getting quite worried, because the developing countries may overtake them in implementation. But the great thing for you is that if you're looking at some of the emerging markets where in the past it may have been difficult to do business with, this agreement will make it easy. So it will give you increased market access in emerging markets, actually in all markets. But I think where it gets really exciting is if we look at emerging markets. That's where really this does have quite a lot of strength and a lot of value. So, as I mentioned, every country has got to make a commitment to the World Trade Organization. And for all the categories, all the measures in the agreement, about 70 of them, they've got to categorize them as category A, category B, or category C. And just to remind you, as I mentioned this earlier, category A means that they're already implemented. Category B, it means the country needs time to implement, and they list the articles where they need time. And category C means they need time and technical assistance. But what no country can do is no country is allowed to say, we're not going to do that, or that measure, or that measure. It's going to be the same for everyone. And that's really important in global trade facilitation. If countries have difficulty, they will have capacity built. So they will be given assistance if they need it. Many countries may say, we can't do this by ourselves. Then the WTO will give them help to implement the agreement. If you want more information, then there's a really good website to look at. If you look at the World Trade Organization, they've set up a dedicated website for the Trade Facilitation Agreement. It's easy to access, and you can look at it country by country by country. So the exciting bit, I think there are two important areas for you here, or three areas. Most exporters are importers as well. So if you're importing something, this will bring down the cost of importing. If you're exporting something, it will bring down the cost of exporting. And it will also bring down the cost in the countries that you're dealing with. So overall, that's going to make you more competitive, and it's going to make export and import operations more streamlined, more efficient, quicker, and less costly. So this really is a very, very exciting agreement, and one that's going to make a really big difference to world trade. What do you think? Any opinions, any comments? As they would say, what is there not to like about it? There's nothing not to like, there's a lot to like about it. You know, it's quite interesting that the World Trade Organization, they should really be publishing this, because it's important that people are aware of it. You know, in my organisation, actually, we have a contract with them at the moment because they've realised this. And we have a contract to go around certain countries and talk to traders, talk to the exporters and importers and say, look guys, this is what's happening, be aware of this. And that's quite important. Because remember, every country has to have a committee to implement the agreement. And traders have got to be represented on that committee. People like all of you have got to be represented. And that means that you can say, okay, we realise that we can't have all the articles implemented at once. We can't have all the measures implemented at once. But from our point of view, these should be the priorities, to do it in this order. And so far, what we've heard in most countries, they tell us that Article 1 is the biggest thing for them, the most important article. And that's the one about availability of information, all in one place. And you know, in every country so far, I think every country, they said, for us, that's the most important thing. As exporting companies, as importing companies, as SMEs, as big organisations, whatever we are, that ability to get all the documents, all the information, all the regulations, all the market access tools from one place is hugely important to us. So it really is a big deal. Really a very, very big deal. Are there any questions on that? What do you think? Someone talk to me.
So much information.
It's too much information. I know, it's a lot for one day. And we're going to stop now, because it is a lot for one day, I know. Please, thank you.
Я думаю, что через 5 лет, если мы... Не, слышно перевод? Переводчик.
Okay, try now. Try now. Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. Thank you.
Я думаю, что через 5 лет при таких темпах принятия законов и постановлений, которые будут облегчать международную торговлю, брокерские компании, которые помогают в данный момент экспортировать или импортировать товар, останутся без работы. Потому что все, чем они обладают, будет в свободном доступе, и можно будет спокойно самостоятельным компаниям проводить такие операции.
Yeah, and that's a really big, and that's a really, okay, and that's a really big advantage, a very big advantage. I mean, you know, the whole concept is making trade easier. So your exports, your imports, the whole process is so much easier, and you don't have to use bogus companies, you don't have to add to the cost of doing business. You know, there'll be a single point of entry for all trade-related documents. It will cut down corruption, it will cut down time, it will cut down cost. That's why it's such an important agreement. You're absolutely right.
Как вы думаете, торговое соглашение кому более выгодно? Экспортерам или импортерам? развитым странам, которые больше экспортируют, или развивающимся странам, которые больше импортируют?
Okay, that's a really good question, or two very good questions there. The first thing to say is what you have to remember is for every export there's an import. That's fair to say, isn't it? For every export there's an import. So when you're looking at the cost of doing business, you have to look at the total cost. Okay? Exactly. So every time someone exports something, someone's going to have to import it. So it benefits both. It benefits both. That's the first thing. And the other thing is most exporters are, not every exporter, but most exporters are also importers. So if you're bringing in components, it will reduce the cost of that import. If you're re-exporting finished goods, it will bring down the cost of exporting the finished goods. So both parties gain. On the second part of your question, another very good question. I think it's true to say, and again, if we go back to the figures, let me just try and go back very, very quickly. So I'm doing this the old-fashioned way. Okay, let's go with that. I mean, what we can see very clearly there is that in terms of percentage savings, developing countries benefit more. And that's because their initial cost is higher. You know, they're on a high cost base. Now, we're on a lower cost base. So if you look at the worst scenario, and you can just add up the cost at the top. So for a developing country, it's 3, 5.8, 7, 8, 10, about 12% potential cost saving. Okay? But their cost of doing business may be 30% higher than it is here. For an OECD country, in other words, for the most developed countries in the world, the cost saving will be less, about 5%, 6%. So yeah, it's definitely true to say that immediately developing countries, their cost base will come down more. But for exporters to developing countries, that gives you better access. Because it's bringing down the landed cost of your product in those countries, and it's making your products more competitive and more viable, because their whole cost of doing business is coming down.
Мне кажется, что ситуация, возможно, такая, что крупные страны-экспортеры получат еще больше преимуществ на чужих местных рынках по ценовому предложению. И развивающиеся страны будут еще больше потребителями, чем производителями, которые смогут что-то продавать. Сейчас, возможно, разница в таможенных пошлинах – это один из сдерживающих моментов, когда развивающаяся страна, закрывая свой рынок, может развить что-то, свое производство уникальное. А в данном случае оно все нивелируется. Импортные машины, комбайны и так далее будут еще более дешевые. Нет смысла тогда делать что-то себя, но мы все будем только покупать то, что производится другими.
Yeah, which is great, because that's how the world develops. That's how the global economy develops. That's how people get wealthier. If they're wealthier, they can buy more. If they can buy more, they can buy more from you. It's how the global economy works. So we shouldn't be worried about that, but we should exploit that. We should exploit that. Because, you know, this is what this is designed to do, to free up global trade. It's not designed to help big exporters or small exporters or big countries or small countries or developed countries or less developed countries. It's designed to open up global trade to anyone who wants to take part in that global trade. And you know, that's the whole concept. And you know, there's a view, there is a view now, I'm not a big on this, but there's a view that in many emerging markets, that they may jump the industrialisation stage. So there's a view that, as most economies develop, they develop from agriculture to industrial to service industries. And there's a view that many emerging markets may jump from agriculture straight to service industries and cut out industrial industry. What does that do for you guys? It gives you more opportunity to export your produce to them. They're not going to make it themselves.
Приведите хоть один пример.
I can't, because no one's done it yet. This is what economists are saying can happen. A country that's nearly done it, but not quite, is India. India did go through the industrial stage, but a relatively short industrial stage. So they have an agricultural economy. Now, the economy of India now is very much ICT, it's regional finance, it's call centres, it's service industries. So even though they did have some industrial stage, that's probably the best example of China. But China's not the opposite. China industrialised, and never stopped industrialising. That's very different. And the Chinese service industry is virtually non-existent because they're very bad at doing services. They're good at making goods, but they're very bad at services. I'm not an economist, and I don't pretend to be. I wouldn't want to be an economist. But what the economists are saying is that, when you take some of the really exciting emerging markets, like some of the African ones, the South American ones, there's no need for them to industrialise. They don't need to do that. They have skilled workforces that, they don't need to be out in factories making things. They can actually be designing software or selling financial services or establishing insurance industries. There's a view to say that, but they're still going to need to buy. So I don't think we should be worried about this. And I don't think it matters whether you're a developed or developing country, whether you're a small exporter or a big one. I don't think it makes any difference, to be honest. What I do think, I think to a large extent it benefits smaller exporters. And the reason I say that is because large exporters, they've got people, they've got time to get market access. They can work out rules of origin to their advantage. They can have these really complicated value chains. So if they're making these things, they can source components from 50 different countries and make part of it, make a subsection here in Ukraine, another subsection in Kazakhstan, another subsection in Thailand. They can do that, and they can work it out, and they can do that very, very well. Because, they've got the time and the people and the organisation to work out the processes, to go through them, to do the documentation, to work out the rules of origin, to make sure they classify everything. But smaller companies can't do that. SMEs don't have the time to do that. What this does is it puts everyone on an equal playing field, as much as possible. It can't do everything. A large company is always going to have larger buying power over a small company, of course. But what it does mean, though, is whereby an SME, a small company, may say, I'm not going to export to Nigeria. It's much too complicated. I haven't got people who can use the letter of credit. I can't do that, and therefore I can't take the risk. The documents will be wrong there, then I won't get paid. And I hear about this a lot from small exporters. There are some markets, I know they're exciting markets, but for me they're too difficult as a small company. This brings down that level. It turns things to, this level playing field where everyone can access any markets a lot easier than they can. I'm not pretending it's going to be 100% perfect. Nothing is 100% perfect. I'm not pretending that you're going to see a result just like that at the click of a finger, because you won't. But, globally, there's no reason to believe that this really will work well. And when you do talk to economists, I try not to talk to economists very often, but when you do talk to them, they will actually tell you that, why are people so worried about import duty rates? And this is a really good example where, if you look at a country like Kenya, a really good market now, middle income, it's not a poor country, it's not developed, it's developed. It's a middle income country. But, people wouldn't trade with Kenya. And one of the reasons they wouldn't trade was landed cost was very high. And Uganda, that area, and Uganda as well. Now, the reason the landed costs were high was not because of import duty. There may be import duty, but the reason the landing costs were high was because transport costs were high. And the reason transport costs is high is because when you've got a truck going from Kenya through to Uganda, in the past it would get stopped 5 or 6 times by customs on the way. And that takes time and it costs money. To get a 20-foot container from Mombasa to Kampala used to cost $5,000. Since they started, and it's not fully implemented in the region, since they started implementing, it's gone down to about $3,000. You know, you can't argue with the numbers. That's one example. It's one example. There are several others. But, you know, globally it's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight. But the end result has got to be a good one in opening up markets. You know, companies like Coca-Cola, Unilever, BP, all the big ones, they've always been able to look after themselves. We don't have to worry about it. They didn't bother about anything here. You know, they can put 300, you know, Coca-Cola in their origin department. They have to have different rules of origin because their packaging comes from different places depending on the market. In their rules of origin department, Coca-Cola have about 200 people. Just working out the rules of origin under different trade agreements for different countries where they're operating. They can do that. They can do that. You know, SMEs, you can't do that. Can you? You know, I've been working for an SME. You can't do that. You know, when I worked for an SME, I was the shipping manager, I was the sales manager, and I was the import clearance manager. You know, we're doing more than one job, aren't we, if we're in a small organisation. So, you know, the big organisations, they've always been able to look after themselves. This puts the SMEs on a much more even playing field. But just so that expectations are correct, you know, don't think you'll see immediately, what do we say, 5% savings overnight, because you won't. That's not going to happen, because they'll bring in the measures gradually over a period, depending on the commitments Ukraine has made to the WTO. So it depends on the country, on, you know, what's happening here in Ukraine and what's happening in the countries that you're selling to. And the speed of implementation won't always be the same. So what we're saying here is it's not going to be like the Big Bang. You know, you won't see this big savings straight away, but you will see it over a period of time. And that's got to be good for expanding global trade and getting Ukrainian products, your really, really good products, into the markets. So thank you, some really good directed questions. Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments? Anything? I know, as you said, it's a lot of information to throw at you today, and I'm going to throw more information at you tomorrow. But don't have nightmares about that, because we can, you know, we can relax the pace that we use. Yeah.
Меня интересует вопрос, как мировые компании и зарубежные страны относятся к украинским компаниям. К их статусу. Они котируются, договора с украинскими компаниями котируются или нет? То есть имеют ли они авторитет? Или все-таки нас относят, например, к тем странам, с которыми, ну, лучше быть аккуратным? Почему такой вопрос возник? Почему возник такой вопрос? Я один раз слышал мнение, что с украинскими компаниями хотят иметь дело только потому, что мы не выполняем условия договора. Может быть, это было давно, в 90-х, в 2000-х, но это мнение осталось. А соответственно, нам закрыты пути к предоплатам, кредитам дешевым и так далее. Есть ли такое мнение в Европе или в мире? Вы его видели, слышали?
No, I haven't. I actually think international business is very simple. I think if you have something someone wants to buy at the right quality, at the right price, they'll buy it. They'll buy it. I know I've spoken to, you know, from the research I've done, I spoke to the Anglos and the British Ukraine Chamber of Commerce, very keen to promote exports between, you know, trade between the countries. You know, so as far as I know, I don't think there's any huge issue. You know, I think people will buy from the country when they want the product and the price is right. I think it's as simple as that. It comes down to your USP. Got the product someone wants, they'll buy it if the price is right. Really. I'm oversimplifying it. Of course I am, to make the point. But I think it's a reality. You know, most buyers around the world, they're very savvy now. The world is globalized. You know, as I said right at the beginning, it's not the way it used to be. It wasn't where there were kind of natural trading partners that countries could always trade with. Things are a lot more open. And a good buyer in a globalized world will source where they can get the right product at the right price. And then they'll find a way to make it work. You know, that's what I find more and more and more. And, you know, let me give you a small example of that, but one that makes the point very, very clearly, I think, is in England, there's a game that we play called darts. Anyone heard of darts? And it's the thing where you have a little thing with an arrow on, and you throw it at the board. And you have to get the dart in the centre. They play the game with parts and bars and things. It's an old-fashioned English game. There's a small company in the west of England that make dart boards. They're round boards, they're made of kind of wood, they have metal on the outside, and you throw the darts at these boards. Okay, the small boards. That company, it's a very small company. Well, you know, it's less than about the size of many of your companies. And what they used to do was they used to make all of the dart boards in the UK and sell them all over the world. But they're clever, and they found a better way of doing this using globalization. So, to give you an example, every dart board they sell in East Africa, and eastwards from there is made in Kenya, in the customs-free zone in Nairobi. And they set up a factory in the customs-free zone. So, because it's in the free zone, legally it's not part of Kenya, it's a customs-free zone. They've set up a factory there. They import the wood, or they take the wood from other countries in Africa. They take the metal, I think, from Kazakhstan, the steel from Kazakhstan or somewhere. There's some cork in it, which they get from another country. They put it all together in Nairobi, and they sell it from there all over the world. Well, not all over the world, in the region east of there. For the American market, they do exactly the same thing in Canada, where they have a plant in Canada, they source the products from the places where the trade agreements are right, where they can get hold of the products, they put them together in Canada, and from there they sell within the free trade area, within Mexico and the USA. That's a small company doing that. You know, a very, very small company doing that. And you know, I went to visit them in Nairobi, and they were saying, you know, and I was talking about exactly your point. Do you have definite sources for the different components of these boards? And they said, no. We'll buy them wherever the price is right and wherever the quality is right. Nowhere is off limits. And what they said was the only countries off limits are those countries that have sanctions, like maybe Iran at the moment, maybe Russia for some reasons. But they said, as far as we're concerned, if there are no sanctions, we will buy from where we get the right product at the right price. And you know, and I think that's the reality. I think that is the global reality. The world is a much smaller place. Much, much smaller place. You know, information is more freely available, travel is a lot easier. You know, really has closed up. Or opened up, anyway, it's not closed up, it's really opened up. So I don't think attitudes towards Ukraine or any other country really make a difference. You know, people will trade with countries where they can get the right products at the right price. I really think it's that simple. You know, another example actually is a Middle Eastern example where it was very interesting. I went to, and it's an extreme case, but it kind of makes the point, where I was asked by the UN to do some training for exporters in Palestine. Now, as you know, Palestine is a disputed area. And, but they have a lot of good products. They have olive oil, other things, mainly agriculture related, a lot of good products. And you know, so I went out to Ramallah to do the training. It was the UN, it was a UN-sponsored training. And I went out to Ramallah, and I was talking to exporters there. And, you know, about their exports and how they want to expand them. And I said to them, well, where do you get the raw materials from? And things like the packaging. And they said, well, Israel products. And I said, well, I thought politically, you know, deal with Israel. And they said, of course we do. They're the best source of the product, the best quality, and we get it at the best price. Of course we do. We don't care. You know, business comes before politics. And that's why, and again, if you look at the Middle East, that's exactly why you've got the peace agreements between Jordan and Israel and between Egypt and Israel. That's why you've got the peace agreements. Because both Jordan and Egypt see the importance of trading with Israel. They can see the importance of that. So, you know, they don't care about political opinions. They really don't care about that. People will trade where they can do the best business. So I've gone a long way around answering your question. But I think that's the thing. If it's the right product at the right price, of course they'll buy your beautiful Ukrainian produce. Of course. Anything else?
Потом завтра можешь.
So,
Я говорю, конечно, есть, но, возможно, уже на завтра оставить наш час.
okay, yeah. Thank you very much. I think everyone's probably had enough for one day with lots of information. Well, look, thank you very much for all your attention today. It's been a great day. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been useful for you. I hope it's been useful. So, you know, don't have any nightmares overnight. Sleep well overnight, ready for tomorrow. Don't forget anything that's worrying you. Write it down on a piece of paper and we can talk about it tomorrow. I don't want you to have any nightmares, any bad dreams. You know, the world is open to your trade. So tomorrow morning, I'm going to put in an extra session, which isn't in your notes, about Incoterms. So we'll cover that tomorrow morning, and then we'll get on with the rest of the agenda. Is that okay? Good. So have a lovely evening. Have a safe journey home. Huh?
Incoterms small.
Yeah, I mean,
Кратко, я хотел сказать. Мало по времени.
well, as brief as I it depends what your, to be honest, it depends what your knowledge levels are. I'll be as brief as I can. I will be as brief as I can, but it's important to get it right. If Incoterms are wrong, forget your exports. Or forget your export, but it's important to get it right. So I'll be as quick as I can, but what I'll need to do in the morning is I'll assess where your knowledge is. I mean, we can do that quickly now. I can assess what the knowledge is. Let me ask some quick questions. This will give me an idea. Let me just throw some quick questions and see if you can answer. It's not a test, but it will just help me to understand. Firstly, how many Incoterms are there? Does anyone know? Great! 11 Incoterms. What is the current version of Incoterms? What is the current version that we're using? Yeah, Incoterms 2010. When is the next version? 2020, that's right. Okay, so I think some of you have good knowledge of this, but we need to have... Oh, let me answer the question which you asked. Why can't we use FOB for containers? Why can't we use FOB for container shipments?
It's very bad. FOB is very bad condition for containers.
You can't use it for containers, you know why? Okay, I'll explain that tomorrow. I don't want to keep you now. I'll explain it tomorrow. Okay, I'll explain that tomorrow. Just a final question so I can assess. Okay, you're selling your product, CPT Singapore, from Odessa. So you load the product here in a container, you send it from Odessa to Singapore. So your selling price is CPT Singapore. Where do you legally deliver the goods? Where is legal delivery? Where is legal delivery? So the container loads here in Mykolaiv, ships from Odessa, arrives in Singapore, CPT Singapore. Where have you legally delivered? What is the legal point of delivery?
To carrier.
Перевозчику.
Нет, сосуд.
Нет. Борт корабля.
Нет,
Там приплыл уже. Надо shipping to Singapore.
Look, you legally deliver when you load the container. The definition is when the cargo is handed to the first carrier. So if you load the container here, if this is the container, as soon as you've loaded it, you have legally delivered the cargo. that's important. So you legally deliver here, but you physically deliver to Singapore. Yeah, so we have 2 delivery points. This is, okay, I'm just trying to gauge the kind of experience levels. So with the C Incoterms, beginning with C, we have 2 delivery points. We have the legal delivery point and the physical delivery point. Okay, let's not worry about this. I'm just getting some idea. So we can we'll make it as compact as we can. Yeah? Yeah. We'll make it as quick as we can. Okay, look, have a lovely evening, everyone. Enjoy your evening, safe journey home, and we'll start again, please, at 9 tomorrow. I think there'll be some refreshments just before 9, but we'll start at 9. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.